Matados, the president of the Dutch Kills Civic Association, and this is our Meet the Candidate series. With us today, we have Pete Harrison, the candidate for New York 12th, the district encompassing Dutch Kills and a large body of Upper Manhattan. Pete, welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Appreciate this. Look forward to talking with everybody.
All right. So introduce yourself. Who are you and what brought you to this point that you're running for the position of congressperson in this district?
Sure. Well, my full name is Peter Harrison. I have been living in the district for the last 13 years. 2 actually in Astoria, but the last 11 have been in Stuyvesant Town in the East Village. And I can say honestly that I don't think I'd be here running for Congress if I had not moved to Stuyvesant Town. Just quickly, 2 things happened there that kind of changed the course of my life. We moved in back in March 2009, so kind of right after the recession hit, but it was still kind of a scary time. I was living with a bunch of bartenders. I was a bartender / writer, which mostly means bartender. And we had the opportunity to move into Stuyvesant Town in a 3-bedroom apartment that we converted to 4. Got a great deal. They were desperate for people at that time, so we came in as market rate tenants. And the first thing that happened that changed my life was about 10 months into our first year, we got a letter saying that we were part of this class action lawsuit that retroactively rent stabilized our apartment and about 4,000 other apartments in Stuyvesant Town. I had no idea what that meant. I read down a little bit further. It meant that my rent went down literally overnight by $1,100. Okay. We got about $3,300 back, and we got this new lease saying we were rent stabilized. I thought I'd hit the lottery. I had no idea anything at that time about rent laws or the class action lawsuits. So to be honest, I had a little bit of Catholic guilt at the time. Mm-hmm. We'd only been living there for a few months. One of my neighbors was an original tenant for 1947, so I didn't really understand like how this happened or why we got this benefit. So I actually at that time joined the Tenants Association to kind of get involved, learn a little bit more about what was happening, and there were a number of other things happening in the Stuyvesant Town complex. So it was a really immense education to learn about tenant organizing and housing law, and I was really inspired by it. And then the second thing happened maybe about 6 months later, and I got a manila envelope on a Sunday night, and it was an eviction notice. I luckily had some resources. I was able to talk to the Tenants Association and get a sense that this kind of didn't seem right. My father was an attorney for the EPA, so I was able to kind of talk to him and say, hey, I don't think this is right as well. So I still had to go to housing court, but at least for me, I was prepared. I kind of knew it was just harassment. Flat out, this was bogus, and I could go in and fight for myself. I had to go multiple times to housing court. I had to fight even a second eviction notice, and it was completely just harassment because they wanted us out to get that apartment back. So I was able to fight back and keep my home, but honestly, the experience of going to housing court for other people is what kind of radicalized me. I saw so many people that didn't really have the resources that I had to be able to fight back. Folks that didn't speak English, folks that maybe were undocumented, folks that honestly didn't even show up for housing court because they couldn't fight back. Right. And I started to sort of feel like, hey, this is the housing market working the way it's supposed to be working. It's there for corporate landlords and these big extremist billionaires to kick people out and get their homes back. And that made me very angry. And at that point, I sort of said, well, I can fight back. So I think that's what I'm going to do with my life. And for me, that meant I got my master's in urban planning at Columbia, focused on tenant organizing and alternative equity models for housing outside of the market. I stayed active with my Tenants Association for all these years since then. And I started putting the dots together to a lot of the other issues, particularly at that time. This was 2010 or so, and Occupy Wall Street really had flared up. And, the Great Recession was caused by speculation in the housing market. And I felt like we had not actually learned anything from that experience. If anything, we made it worse. We doubled down on the financialization of housing, bailed out the banks instead of homeowners. I recognize that housing really has to be at the center of a lot of progressive activism, and that's really where I've stayed involved through multiple rent fights. The most recent one this year was probably the most successful. We actually got a statewide coalition of tenant groups together and got most of this universal rent control package together. So that really kind of motivated me to run, and I felt like people weren't talking about housing at the federal level, and people were saying that this is something that, oh, you should just do locally, but it's the federal government that's involved in this process.
So I understand your motivations, and I do respect that. But there's a distinction between being motivated for a position and having the qualifications to fulfill that position. So what about your history? What about your record do you think makes you qualified to be our representative in Congress?
Fair question. I think three reasons. One, I have been in this district for 13 years doing the work on the ground, particularly around housing activism, both because of my personal experience in Stuyvesant Town and the work that I've done in other communities organizing tenants to fight for better housing protections. Two, I have done that at a activist and as an entrepreneur level. I've started two businesses, so I know what it's like on the private sector. I know how hard it is to sort of get started in our economy that's kind of rigged against us. And I can speak to the level of activism and entrepreneurship and technology that we need to challenge to solve these challenges. And I think the third point is I have a lot of policy experience at the national level with housing specifically. I, before running, was a senior housing advisor for Data for Progress, which is a progressive think tank. I had the opportunity to co-author the Homes for All report, which outlines this national progressive agenda to solve the housing crisis, both in big cities like New York and more rural communities across the country. And with that, I've had the opportunity to work with Senator Sanders on his housing plan, with Senator Warren on her housing plan, Secretary Castro, People's Action for Homes Guarantee. So I've been in this policy space at the national level with those players for a very long time. It's a very exciting time at the national level for housing policy, and we need more advocates there that have that policy experience, but have also lived the crisis personally, and I'm that person.
I'm going to go now to issues that have been brought forward to members of the Dutch Kills community, some of the issues that we're facing, and how you at a federal level would deal with those. And the first one is the post office. Our post office has had a history of not accurately and consistently delivering the mail in the Dutch Kills area, which is a part of NY12. There are a very large number of residents, including many seniors, who are completely dependent upon that service. If you were elected to Congress, what steps would you take to help us address this situation?
I mean, I think this speaks to kind of a larger problem at the federal level, where we just have this constant austerity, where we cut taxes for the rich, so we don't invest in programs like the Postal Service, like the Social Security Administration. So at the earliest stage and the broadest level, I'm going to be up there advocating for more funding for everything and more involvement with the federal government. There was a time where, the federal government was kind of the cavalry, that when things weren't working locally, you could turn to the federal government to get funding and to get justice, for lack of a better word. So I think the post office is this great example where, to some degree, we have subsidized all of these other private actors, the FedExes of the world, UPS or whatever, to sort of compete against the public sector. So on the one hand, we're giving all this tax benefit to these private actors while we're undercutting the public sector. And of course, a lot of folks rely on the post office for that. So I think giving more funding, updating the technology particularly, finding more folks that have accountability and responsibility within these organizations is a really big part of it. I think also, there is an element here that technology has to sort of solve some of these gaps for coverage for folks. I know a lot of older folks are not necessarily comfortable with technology, and I don't think it's forcing someone to change their daily habits of getting their mail in physical form versus online. But there's a conversation there that I think there are efficiencies that we can have from technology that can improve probably like the end result of delivery for that.
Okay. In line with that, the congressperson from New York 14, which is a neighboring district, has proposed that the post office, the same post office that we're currently dealing with these delays in misdelivered mail, be expanded as of right, where it starts to do ATMs, paycheck cashing, bill payment, and electronic money transfers, similar to the way it used to be 60 or 70 years ago. Even with the current problems in the system, would you support such an expansion, or would you be opposed to it?
I actually very much support that. I think the Postal Service is a great source for public banking. There's, on its own side, a lot of population in this country is underbanked, and they are prone to predatory pay lenders and all kinds of other predatory actions. So I think providing public banking services from the post office really makes a lot of sense. You mentioned it, we did this 60 or 70 years ago. So there's a model there that we can build on. I understand folks that are skeptical of it because of how the post office functions on a sort of interaction at this point. But I think it's too easy to say that we can't trust the government to work on our behalf or provide services efficiently. Like, we have been there before. The post office is arguably one of the most successful public service agencies we've had ever in the history of America. So I think it's a matter of having folks there that understand that gap between coverage and recognizing why our government is not working as well as it is. It's not because it's innately incapable, it's that it's being starved for resources, starved for talent. So I'm very much a supporter of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez expanding the post office into public banking. I think it's a great service, and I think it can be done very efficiently, but you need people there championing it.
Okay. I'm going to move now to an issue which is one of the primary issues of your campaign, which is housing. Now, specifically to this district, there are thousands of units within New York 12 which are being used in part or exclusively for the short-term rental market, for example, through Airbnb. Do you feel that this market should be regulated? And if so, to what extent?
Yeah, I mean, I've actually been on record saying I think Airbnb is a really good small idea, but it's a really bad big idea. And it's one thing if, and I've got friends, I won't say who, that spend a couple weeks visiting family outside of New York City. They put Airbnb on for a couple weeks or something like that once every couple of years. That's a good small idea to some degree. But of course, that profit motive has turned into complete landlords of buildings, not actually giving leases to tenants, but having the short-term turnover for Airbnb. So there's absolutely a play for regulation. I think Airbnb, unfortunately in New York State, has been a very bad actor about sharing data until really forced to do so. I think ultimately the point of all of this is that housing shouldn't be seen as this commodity that can be flipped and profited from. It's got to be a source of shelter. So I think you have to regulate both an Airbnb type scenario of short-term renters. You have to regulate even the sort of long-term speculation of folks buying condos anonymously and just kind of parking money in them, which is a big problem of real estate. So I think, at the federal level, the tax code has kind of incentivized this form of speculation, incentivized Airbnb, particularly in gentrifying neighborhoods. So there are ways that you can use the tax code to end that type of speculation.
A specific example regarding Airbnb. If you have Section 8 or rent control tenants doing short-term subletting of their apartments, should those tenants lose their lease?
As a tenant organizer, I'll probably never support someone losing their home as a blanket statement. But I do think there is a social contract that we have for anyone seeking assistance or having assistance for renters. But I guess I push back a little bit on the narrative, and this is something that comes up too for public housing residents. This idea of sort of exploiting this assistance. I think the larger problem for Airbnb is it's sort of predicated under people having income insecurity. The idea that you can't make ends meet because of your job right now, you've got to rent out your home, is a deeply pernicious problem that I think gets lost sometimes in these conversations. The bottom line is people should have enough security from their job and in their home to not have to pimp out their home on these types of things. So I think that's kind of the larger problem I have with Airbnb predicated on that. But I do think there is a social contract that we have that I think folks that are in a situation of Section 8 subsidies or from rent stabilization, they shouldn't sort of be turning around in that. And I can speak specifically in Stuyvesant Town. I think back in 2014, 2015, I might be wrong, that was actually the first time Airbnb agreed to prevent rentals from going on their website because Stuyvesant Town is rent stabilized. So to Airbnb's belated credit, they kind of recognized that. But yeah, it's a deeper problem of economic insecurity that are forcing people into these positions a little bit. So,
fair enough. On the flip side of that, apartment building owners who reserve their market value apartments for Airbnb, they own the buildings. Should they face penalties for taking these properties off the market and using them for short-term subletting?
Yes, and honestly, for the same reason some of us might have contentions about folks getting Section 8 or rent stabilization, is that landlord is getting public subsidies in their property. They're getting real estate taxes, capital gain taxes, passive income tax breaks. So I think there's frankly no difference between a home renter and a home owner in this scenario of having a social contract of you have this asset to do a certain end, provide housing in your neighborhood for it. Short of doing that, you are taking from the public in that case. So I think it's very much the same social contract of, I don't think a landlord who's in the multifamily business should be renting out in short-term leases at all.
How about a single family homeowner?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I have had some conversations with kind of folks on both sides of this. I think that's fair. I think if you own your home, if you have a bedroom upstairs or a basement apartment, whatever is under occupancy laws and zoning laws, I think that's fair to do that. You get into the more gray zone where is it a second home? Is it a speculative home that's impacting gentrification or displacement? Those are complicated issues, but I think that's certainly an issue where I could have a good faith, like let's figure out a middle ground here.
The issue I want to move to now is campaign financing. It's been a very hot button issue in the modern political climate. And the first question I want to put forward is your campaign funded entirely by small donor individual donations, or do you receive money from PACs or super PACs, any other corporate financing?
Yes, I am very proud to be just a strictly 100% grassroots campaign. I've taken a number of pledges against taking corporate PAC money, real estate money, fossil fuel money, basically any big bad source of money I have sworn off. I am committed to getting corporate money out of our politics and frankly corporate money out of our economy in some cases. So I think you've got to walk the walk on that. And I think on the one hand, I'm not too worried about it. The real estate industry is not going to give me money. I'm kind of an existential threat to them to some degree. So it's not that I'm turning down big chunks of money anyway. But what I am doing is, and I think I'm not alone in this in other congressional races, other local races, is it is inspiring people that have become very cynical about our political system to say, okay, there is somebody that is a grassroots person that's sworn off this money that is running because of that as an issue. So seeing that makes me more excited to give $20, $50, whatever that is. And there are a lot of people out there that are inspired by that. So I think, you don't need as much money as you used to run for these offices. I think that was always a myth that sort of corporate Democrats wanted you to believe. But also there are other sources for small donors. And I think that's a beauty of technology and a beauty of sort of the good side of social media to some degree. So there are a lot of opportunities for us to raise the money that we need for this campaign outside of taking all that dirty money.
Okay. I'm going to put you on the record, and you can answer with a yes or no, just so we have it for posterity. Has your campaign received any funding from the Democratic Party at the local, state, district, or national level?
No.
No.
Not holding my breath either.
Has your campaign received any funding or support from a connected PAC, like the American Bankers Association or the Sheet Metal, Air Rail, and Transportation Union?
No.
Has your campaign received any funding or support from a leadership PAC, like the Majority Committee PAC or AmeriPAC?
No.
Has your campaign received any support or endorsements from a super PAC, like the Congressional Leadership Fund or the American Bridge to the 21st Century?
No.
All right, fair enough. Do you have any other comment you would like to make about funding campaign finance in our government? Do you take any official position on that?
Yeah, I mean, the Citizens United decision made all of this much, much worse and really unleashed an immense amount of corporate money, sort of dark money into our political system. I think even many Democrats that sort of lamented on the one hand still say, well, the other guys are doing it, we might as well do it too. At some point, someone has to say, you are compromising our policy at this point by taking that money. It's fairly obvious that that's the case over the 40 years of economic inequality that has exploded in this country. So I just think voters, whether they would consider themselves liberal, conservative, or moderate, are just tired of it. So there's nothing to be gained from taking that. I'm a democratic socialist, so I want us to have more democratic oversight of our political system, and that means getting corporate money out of it. It means getting it out of our elections, it means getting it out of our lobbying efforts, it means getting it out of our policy levels. So to me, it's not just about getting corporate money out of our campaigns. It is about, once you get in office, there's such this system of lobbying trips or expensive dinners or conferences or these like thinly veiled think tanks that are really just driving a very ideological or pro-corporate policy and writing them and handing them over to congressional folks to support. So it's part of a bigger problem here. So I want to be very clear that I am not taking corporate money at the election cycle, but once I get in there, I'm going to be fighting it at the lobbying level, at the committee level, at the policy drafting level, because that's where all this stuff gets done. That's the sausage making.
I'm going to move now to an issue that I know you're somewhat familiar. Amazon recently withdrew their proposal to move part of their headquarters to the Long Island City Dutch Kills area. Did you have a position on that move when they were trying to come into our community?
Oh yes, very much so. I was
What was
very
your position?
against the Amazon headquarters deal.
Why?
Couple of reasons, and actually I remember I was actually speaking at Dutch Kills the night that the deal was canceled. I think that was the first time we met. I think to start out with, I suspect that if you polled folks in Newark 12 right now, I bet probably 55, maybe even 60% of voters would still say Amazon was a good thing, they should have come in, jobs, investment, etc. So I think we're already starting from a certain behind the eight ball on that. But as I had said in multiple op-eds during the time and multiple canvassing efforts in Dutch Kills and Queensbridge, this was not ever about jobs. This was not ever about economic development. This was a corporate land grab. Amazon has been doing this for 20 years across the country, where they kind of play off different municipalities or city governments to get basically free public money for something that they were already going to do and could easily afford. There's no doubt that Amazon had decided, we're going to do a DC office, we're going to do a New York City office, but rather than just go pay fair wage, market rate, whatever that is, let's go get these folks to compete against each other, and let's go nationally and have everybody compete for this big, bucket of money that we're going to promise. And I think when it got to New York, people forget this, but it was, 25,000 jobs, 25,000 jobs. The original request for proposal back in 2017 was 50,000 jobs. So already right out of the gate, Amazon was completely disingenuous about what they were actually going to be bringing to any city that won this competition. So that should tell you a lot about the incentives and the integrity here. But once you look at the actual numbers within that, and trust me, I have an urban planning degree in this. This is stuff that I studied extensively. The memorandum of understanding that they signed never guaranteed 25,000 jobs. Now, Amazon was going to bring jobs. There are already 6,000 jobs here locally. They're going to transfer a bunch of jobs from Amazon headquarters in Seattle. So the idea of this magical new job creation of 25,000 jobs that was somehow going to benefit folks here, benefit folks in Queensbridge, was never going to happen in the first place. So I think a lot of politicians, a lot of folks in the media that were kind of just rehashing these terms that Amazon PR was talking about were either not doing their homework and frankly not aware of how Amazon has promised these types of things before, or perhaps even more disingenuously kind of knew that they weren't going to deliver this stuff, but that's what we've been doing for 40 years, just showering money on corporations for job creation, and nobody calls us out for it. So no one's going to call us out for this. It's Amazon. So I think starting at that point to say, hey, these folks are not operating in good faith. These are not commitments to the neighborhoods that are going to be affected by this. They're going to be bringing in jobs. They're going to be bringing in new residents that are going to make a lot more money. They're naturally going to displace a lot of folks here. Property taxes are going to go up. This is not something that is a critical need in New York City right now. We do not have a jobs problem in New York City. We have an infrastructure problem. We have, in Dutch Kills, we have sewers flooding when it rains. We've got the 7 train that's crowded. We've got schools at capacity. Those are the problems we have. Giving $3 billion to Amazon doesn't solve them. And if the argument is, well, we'll give $3 billion and they'll have all these jobs and all this economic activity, maybe, but they could also easily afford to do that. So why don't we put that $3 billion into our schools, into our sewers, into our trains, and let Amazon come here if they want to anyway? So that's, a really, really pernicious thing that we're stuck with. Even a lot of Democrats that consider themselves pro-labor, pro-small business, pro-neighborhood are just rehashing these same corporate talking points. So,
Well, then, under what circumstances do you feel using federal monetary incentives for private industry is appropriate? What metrics would you use to measure whether or not a corporation should receive tax breaks or federal funding? Is there a point where that's appropriate?
I absolutely think it's appropriate for the federal government to intervene in the economy. We do it every time, or all the time. I sort of reject the idea that there actually is a free market. The government decides kind of what we want to be generating economic growth. Like, it's not an accident that Wall Street is so large and so powerful. We've passed laws, of course, written by Wall Street, to make it powerful and large and sort of unregulated. So to me, I think we've got to get back into the legal system to make what is a clear legal bias towards corporations and shareholders and reverse that. Make that for workers, make that for stakeholders in our community. We have an existential threat of climate disaster right in front of our faces. And the federal government has to play a massive role in transitioning our economy away from fossil fuels, away from extractive industries, away from financial instruments that benefit from those types of extraction activities, and put money and resources, both social capital and financial capital, into what I call the new economy of care, the Green New Deal for cities, and the Homes Guarantee. These are things that will benefit our schools, will benefit our train systems, our sewers, our homes. That's where the federal government should be putting our capital into, or resources. Like, invest in us. Like, we don't need to give money to corporations. We need to help people, make it easier to start businesses and start worker collectives. Like, that's what we should be investing in, and that's what we used to do in a lot of cases.
All right. I'm going to switch gears a little bit now. I want to talk to you about marijuana legalization. The questions are, do you think marijuana should be recategorized from being a Schedule I drug on the federal level? Should it be legalized? And if so, to what extent? Recreational? Medicinal? Is there an age limit? Where do you stand on that issue?
So for about 10 years of my 20s and early 30s in New York City, I was a drug dealer. And what I mean by that was I was a bartender. And that is a legal drug, and we have regulated that both socially, economically, politically, at 21, certain blood levels, etc. I think not doing that for marijuana very specifically was absolutely racially motivated. It's part of this larger false narrative about the war on drugs. So even just right there, as a bartender for so many years, I can say that marijuana is effectively the same type of level, should have the same type of legal protections. It was an excuse to lock up black and brown people in this country for many, many years. And it's exciting to see the criminal justice reform that's happening and the deeper questions at the federal level about drug policy, because that's what the war on drugs was about. It was about racial discrimination, particularly in our cities. So I think marijuana legalization is a really good start. And I think expunging people's records, so if you had a marijuana conviction, federal or state, that should be expunged. It's making it a lot harder for folks to get jobs once they're out. So I think that's part of this larger conversation about criminal justice reform in this country. And I'm very excited to support it and very excited to be a part of it.
So to be clear, you are in support of recreational marijuana being legalized?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I wouldn't make the distinction between what categories of marijuana. I think the same issue at how we regulate alcohol effectively should be, and probably at a lower age for marijuana. So I don't think the government has any upside for criminalizing it in any capacity. But I would say that the downside of just sort of rapidly decriminalizing it is it doesn't bring justice to the communities that were victimized by the criminalization of marijuana. So if we just legalize it, if we just turn it over to entrepreneurs and make money off of it without bringing justice back to the communities that were affected by these drug laws, we've missed an opportunity to kind of right some of these wrongs. So I think that's where I would want more focus put onto, is how do we legalize it and how do we sort of normalize it in an economic sense that does bring justice to the communities that were victimized by it.
Fair enough. Well, since you talked a bit about the war on drugs and the disproportionate effect on minorities and lower income, let's talk about another polarizing issue in this community, and that's stop and frisk and broken windows. those policing mechanisms have been highly contentious and a very polarizing issue throughout New York. The evidence points to those programs disproportionately targeting lower-income minorities. However, many claim that banning their use undercuts the NYPD's ability to effectively police and ensure the safety of our communities. What measures would you advocate to ensure community safety while protecting the civil rights and liberties of our most vulnerable citizens?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I disagree with the assessment that stop and frisk somehow kept us safer. I think it actually had the opposite effect. I think there's a number of studies and a number of research that have come out about that, where militarizing our police in local communities, particularly in communities of color, has the opposite effect. It makes people distrustful of the police. If there's a domestic abuse scenario, you're going to be less likely to call the police, and that might be a worse case for that victim. If there's not trust between the police and a community, objectively a violent crime or a property crime might not get reported or solved. So I think the idea that somehow crime was reduced because of stop and frisk was a myth that really hasn't panned out, particularly because, to Mayor de Blasio's credit, he stopped it and crime is still going down. Even recently, Mayor Bloomberg has apologized for it, perhaps conveniently because he's thinking about running for president, but he has unfortunately been reluctant to do so before that, when there was a number of evidence that that wasn't a good case. So, but to go back to your question of, how do we balance the need for sort of community policing with community protection and civil liberties? I don't think that's a binary like pro or con, or it's a zero-sum game. I think the idea of what the police should be doing, we've got too narrow a focus on that, and I do think, to be clear, that there are a lot of folks in the police leadership, both on the department side and in the unions, that kind of buy into this war mentality that you've got to get in there and be tough on the streets like this. And I think that's not how you build up trust for communities. That's not how you enforce public safety. So I think, the larger movement, it's kind of considered the abolitionist movement of getting rid of prisons and the carceral state, de-escalating the violence in our police system that has targeted communities of color. These are conversations that are happening both at local levels in many cities and states, but at the federal level. And again, like, the point is, we all want public safety. We want, however old you are, or however young you are, to feel safe in your neighborhood. We have to recognize that a lot of people don't feel safe in the neighborhoods because of the police presence and because of police tactics. That's certainly more of a local issue than a federal issue, but there are ways that the federal government has ramped up that sort of militarization of the police by selling excess military gear, by having sort of incentives over locking folks up and giving money to private prisons, and this sort of like prison to school pipeline. So there's the steps that we can take that sort of change the dynamic that I learned a lot from working on the Tiffany Caban campaign for DA. I think even though she lost in a very unfair way, that was a great opportunity to change the conversation of the carceral state. So that's stuff I want to take to the federal level for sure.
Okay. One of the fastest ways that a congressperson can help people in their district is through their constituent outreach. A person in the district needs help, they reach out to your office, and you provide the resources and the knowledge to be able to help them. Currently, the current system in New York 12, a request can only be made in person or by mail. Would you look to expand the constituent services availability of your office if you were to get it? And in what way? How do you ensure that the people in your district know that you're there, know that they can come to you, and how do they reach you? How do you expand your constituent services?
Actually, I didn't know you could only make requests to the representative's office in person or by mail. That's unfortunate. Well, I am a tenant organizer, and the experience there is all about meeting the person where they live, meeting the person where they are, figuratively and literally. So I think having just more outreach in the first place by going to local community events, by showing up to neighborhoods, by showing up to houses is a big part of what we have to do at the federal level. I think sometimes there's this distance that we feel of, this person's in DC doing God knows what, but you should feel like, oh yeah, that's Pete. He lives, in Stuytown, around the neighborhood. I see him all the time. I see his staff all the time as volunteers. Something that I hold very tightly as a democratic socialist is it's not my job to come in and save communities from the problems that we face. It's like, how do I empower the communities to fight for themselves and fight for each other? So, I've learned that fighting for my own home. Like, no one's going to fight for your home as much as you are. So how do I, as a representative, help you do that? And that's by listening, by being more accessible to doing that, by getting more community feedback of the policies that I should be supporting and fighting for. And a lot of that is the casework. I mean, we are ultimately in constituency services, whether it's a person that voted for me, whether it's a Republican, whether it is someone that's not engaged in the political process. We have to represent everybody in our district. And I think that takes the commitment to doing so. And you can kind of tell when somebody believes that or not by the way they run their campaign, the work that they've come from, the work that they've been informed by. And I think I very much represent that grassroots reach out mentality. And that's what I'll bring as a congressperson.
An issue that's been plaguing this community for a very long time, and that's the Ravenswood Generating Station. It's right down the hill here. It has been one of the top polluters in New York State. Its emissions directly affect the health of hundreds of thousands of neighboring residents. It also provides power and heat to over 20% of New York City. How do you propose that we address the damage being caused by those emissions and work to prevent future health conditions from developing while still ensuring that the city's energy needs are met?
As much as we talk about the climate crisis and the next superstorm Sandy and all of these really big kind of scary projects that we've got to do to sort of protect ourselves and mitigate, the bottom line is much of the pollution already in our environment is from our infrastructure, whether it's the power plants, the highways, the Newtown Creek, for example. There's a lot of this legacy pollution that we've built up over 100 years, and we kind of have to start there because that's really where people have asthma, where people have heart diseases. So it's not an overnight solution. You can't just turn off the power plant, tear it down, and things are solved. But what you can do at the personal level, at the health level, this is why I am such a firm believer in single-payer Medi-Cal for all, because right now, and particularly in Ravenswood houses, there's disproportionate health outcomes because of that because of the location of that power plant. A lot of folks don't have good health care. So by having full coverage, no matter what, we can mitigate a lot of those problems for people right now, make sure they don't die prematurely, don't have asthma, don't have diabetes. At the level of the environmental aspect of this, one of the things I talk about for the Green New Deal for cities is we do need to have our control over our power grid. Right now, because it is these private utilities that spend millions of dollars on compensating their CEOs, all their investors, there isn't a lot of incentive for them, whether at the power creation or the transmission side, to update and to decarbonize the power system. So you kind of just have to force people to do that because we don't have enough time to sort of wean off of this. But I think the good thing about that is there are power sources outside of fossil fuel generation, Ravenswood plant as an example of this, that really can mitigate this. But I think the other side of it is it's not a one-to-one transfer. You mentioned 20% of the power generation. In a green economy, we don't need to transfer 20% from this fossil fuel power plant into a renewable energy. We can create more efficiencies in our building stock, in our transportation systems, and our food sources that reduce the power we need altogether. So I think that's a big part of the conversation of saying, let's not worry about replacing 20% of fossil fuel energy in the Ravenswood plant. Let's figure out how we can reduce that demand, how we can mitigate some of the problems we've had environmentally through other means, and then get rid of that power plant and get rid of those pollutants right now.
Fair enough. In line with the environmental questions, the New York 12 district encompasses large swaths of New York City's waterfront. Much of the entire area is on the FEMA flood evacuation maps. In what ways would you, if you were the elected federal representative, assist the city and the state in protecting the district from damage from the next large-scale flood, the next superstorm? And Have you been satisfied with the response and assistance that FEMA has provided us in recent years?
No, we are really screwing this up pretty badly. I was in Stuyvesant Town during Superstorm Sandy. We lost power for 9 days. The water came up to about, 100 yards from my doorstep. A bunch of my neighbors lost cars. On the one hand, that experience was one of the most inspiring things I've ever been a part of. With the Tenants Association, with the National Guard, we did door-to-door canvassing in all 11,400 apartments for like a week. A lot of older residents were stuck in higher floors. It was getting cold. There weren't a lot of resources. So I'm immensely proud of being a part of the Tenants Association during that effort. I believe we can do anything we need to do to mitigate a crisis like that. What has been frustrating is that the feeling that I got, that sort of collective, like, we're all in this together vibe, it's just been lost these 7 years kind of since then. And it's very much a problem for the East River Resiliency Project that was just passed in the city council recently. That's maybe you could squint and say that maybe prevents the Superstorm Sandy from affecting Stuyvesant Town and some of the places around it, but that's not really protecting other communities on the waterfront. And if there's a massive storm surge that is now not coming into Stuyvesant Town, it's got to go someplace else. Is it going to come across the river here? I'm not a climatologist, I don't know, but the point of it is we are not solving climate change and every possible risk within climate disaster. It's not good enough that we're saying let's just build a giant wall to prevent Superstorm Sandy. Like, there are other climate risks in New York State and New York City that we are at risk at, and without a holistic view of that, we're never going to solve these things. I mean, you build a giant wall from the Williamsburg Bridge up to 26th Street that is a different project than what's going to be talked about at the city level at Wall Street. I don't know what they're talking about at Roosevelt Island. I don't know what they're talking about on this side of the river. There isn't a waterfront mitigation plan. And that's crazy to me. Like, there are hundreds of miles of waterfront in New York City alone, and we don't actually have a regional plan for that. It's just kind of piecemeal. And like, only the federal government can really do that. I am shocked that we don't have the leadership at the federal level talking about these types of problems.
Okay. In addition to that plan, are there any other policy standpoints or initiatives that you would advocate or currently support to help to deal with this, like the climate crisis, any of the changes?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of have to start by asking yourself, what climate risks are we trying to mitigate? What can we prevent? What can we slow down? What can we just have to sort of live with? Obviously, major storms like a Superstorm Sandy are these kind of real threats because it happened not that long ago, and it's not going to be 100 years before something like that happens again. But the really long-term goal is that the sea levels are going to be rising, and that is 10 feet, 12 feet, whatever it is. If it's 50 years, if it's 100 years from now, that is a reality. And I love the term, it's not just a climate denier anymore that's a problem, it's the climate delayer is the problem. And I think there are a lot of folks in the Democratic leadership that are climate delayers. They don't doubt that we have a lot of these big problems. We don't doubt that they're existential and they're really complicated, but someone else can deal with that. So that's where I think we do need this generational shift in who's calling these shots. But then it is, how do we resist against heat increases and heat index? We've got, fires in the West Coast, for example, more hurricanes in the Gulf area. So every region in this country has different problems. New York City, of course, has rising sea tide, but it's not just good enough to say, let's build a seawall in one part of the river. It's not good enough to say, let's have some target of decarbonizing our economy by 2050 or something. We really do need a massive transformation of what our expectations are as consumers, as citizens, as neighbors. And that is a conversation that I think scares some people, but I think it also opens up some really amazing opportunities for jobs, for investment, for better community engagement, for better resources and services in our community. So I don't want to be an alarmist when I say that I really believe existentially we are at risk, because we are. But I think it's also a really good conversation to have, because we can flip it very quickly to say, and here's the plan that we can solve this. Here's how we can mitigate against a Superstorm Sandy. We can mitigate against sea rises. We can mitigate against heat index, whatever these problems are. These are opportunities for us to rise to the occasion, just like we did in Stuyvesant Town during Superstorm Sandy.
Okay. Well, let's switch once again, and I want to talk to you about taxation. The federal tax rate for all corporations is 21%. The federal tax rates for individuals making $55,000 is 22%. The federal tax rate for individuals making $160,000 is 24%. And the federal tax rate for money made by trading stocks is 15%. Is the tax structure we currently have effective and appropriate? And what changes would you make to it, if any?
Yeah, it's pretty crazy that corporations are taxed less than like working class families. I think that says everything you need to know about what our political system has been for the last 40 years. It absolutely privileges big real estate developers, corporate monopolies, and extremist billionaires. And those are the big bad guys in my campaign that I talk about. So, you know, it's crazy that a family that's making whatever the income is has to pay more taxes than a corporation. And of course, we all know that 21% tax rate is still effectively zero for Amazons and all these other corporations that find other loopholes and sort of capital gain tax ways. So, like, it's a system that has been gamed. It's a system that will continue to be gamed unless we really step back and say, what is the purpose of our fiscal system? What is the purpose of our taxation process? I'm a big proponent of what's called modern monetary theory. And it's a little wonky, but right now we deal with a economic system where you think of the government as the household budget, where you've got money coming in, money going out, and you've got to balance that. And if there's a deficit, that's bad because the family runs up a deficit, they lose their home, they can't feed their kids. The federal government is not the same thing as that. The federal government has a monopoly over our currency. That doesn't mean we can just print as much money as we want, because that would drive inflation and prices would go up and be crazy. But what it does mean is we don't have to worry about deficits if we are investing those dollars into things that produce social good. So for example, we have $1 trillion tax cut that just blew up our deficit that's going to corporations. Like, nobody on the Republican side of the aisle cares about deficits, and they never have. But they're right to, because it doesn't matter, right? Like, the federal government is never not going to pay whatever services it has. What we've been bad about is spending all this money on corporate tax cuts for the wealthy, or sort of endless wars internationally. So the idea of like, well, let's reverse that. Let's say we can build homes for everybody that needs homes. We can have a jobs guarantee. We can build more trains. We can build a holistic 500-mile flood plan in New York City. Like, we have the resources to do that. We also have the capacity of doing that in a way that doesn't increase prices, that does not cause inflation or other pressures in the economy. Like, we can put resources wherever we want to. So I think the whole tax system is this larger problem that we have of like, whoa, like, if we're cutting taxes for corporations, that means we've got to cut taxes or cut spending for social services or something. That's like completely not true. It's very much a right-wing thing that unfortunately a lot of Democrats have bought into as well. So I think it's not just a matter of tweaking wealth tax here, estate tax there. I think those are good purposes. It's not just about cutting military spending, which I think we have to, but it is a larger conversation of like, where are we putting our resources? Like, we can't print money endlessly, but we can certainly afford to have a jobs guarantee, to have a homes guarantee, to have a Green New Deal, if we put those resources legally in those things. Like, so that's really where it might sound radical at this time. A lot of folks are just kind of hearing about modern monetary theory for the first time. It's been around for many decades academically. But that's a conversation that we need to have in this country, because the tax system's not working the way that it's working now. Okay. And it's not fair, because it is just going to be on homeowners, higher property taxes, whatever that stuff is. That's not a fair system.
Okay. Is there any issue or anything that, if you could speak directly to the residents of this community, that you would like them to know about? I'm going to yield the floor to you. Is there anything you would like to bring forward and make our neighbors aware of, or anything you would like to speak to them about?
Yeah, appreciate it. I guess I'll speak directly into the camera. I've obviously been talking a lot about housing. That's my activist background. That's my academic background and my professional background. But when I talk about housing as this center to talk about economic justice and racial justice and climate justice, I want to be clear that I'm not a one-issue candidate. I think housing touches all of these issues, whether you're a home renter or a homeowner. So I want to make that a stress point of everything that is in our in our communities in Dutch Kills or in Stuyvesant Town can be addressed by having somebody advocating for them that has a housing background, that recognizes how housing interacts with healthcare and local social determinants like pollution. Housing impacts our tax policy. Housing impacts our schools, our transportation, our sewers. So we really need somebody at the federal level that will center that issue. But the other things that I'm really focusing on as well, I think cities are the best weapon we have against climate disaster, against racial injustice, against climate or economic inequality. We need more champions at the federal level that are fighting for cities specifically. It shocks me that we don't have an urbanist that's saying, hey, the cities should have more power economically, should have more power politically in this country. I love living in New York City. I'm getting married next year. I want to raise kids eventually. And I want to be able to do that in a city. And I don't know if I can because of how expensive it is, because of how hard it is to raise kids. I don't know how you guys do it. But I want that. So I'm fighting for that because I'm fighting for my future. I'm fighting for my family. My tagline for my campaign is New York is a home for all. And I believe that with my heart. I'm named after my grandfather, who was an Irish immigrant, came to Bay Ridge in the 1930s, was a Union motorman on the subway trains, what's now the R train, his entire career, raised 4 kids, including my mother, had a house. Like, that's what I want. That's what I want my brothers and sisters that are first generation immigrants. That's what I want for you. I want that for your kids too. So that's the center of why I'm running. That's why I do think we need change. And not just for the sake of change for change, but a change because we need a different vision for what this country should be and what the city should be. And I'm ready to do that.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. Appreciate it.
Us. And just let the people know how can you be reached on social media and on the internet or for your campaign? Give yourself a plug.
Absolutely. My website is www.peterfornewyork.com. New York and 4 are spelled out. My hashtag on Twitter is Pete Harrison NYC. I think on Instagram and Facebook, it's Peter Harrison 2020. I live in Stuyvesant Town. I'm out on the streets every weekend and every night, so I hope to see you out there, and I hope to speak at the Dutch Kills Civic Association again soon.
Very good. And I'm Tony Benetatos, the president of the Dutch Kills Civic Association. Thank you very much for joining us, and please join us for our other Meet the Candidates series. Thank you.